In the darkest depths of 1942, the Battle of the Atlantic hung by a thread. German U-boats were sinking Allied merchant ships faster than they could be built, starving Britain of food and oil. The Royal Navy faced a terrifying logistical nightmare. The Mid-Atlantic Gap, a vast stretch of ocean beyond the reach of land-based aircraft where U-boats could hunt with impunity. The Allies needed aircraft carriers to close this gap, but they had run out of steel. Every available ounce of metal was being poured into tanks and battleships. Desperation breeds madness, and in this climate of fear, the British War Office received a proposal so bizarre, so scientifically impossible, that it should have been thrown in the trash. Instead, Winston Churchill wrote a note on the file that simply said, "Examine this effectively." The proposal was to build the largest warship in human history. A floating island 2,000 feet long, capable of carrying heavy bombers. And they were going to build it out of ice. The mind behind this frozen leviathan was Geoffrey Pike, a man who skirted the line between genius and insanity. Pike realized that while steel was scarce, the Arctic provided an infinite supply of building material. His initial plan was to tow massive natural icebergs south to act as floating airfields. But natural ice had a fatal flaw. It was brittle, unstable, and would roll over and melt in warmer waters. Pike needed something stronger. He found his answer in a mixture that would bear his name, pykrete. By mixing 14% wood pulp sawdust with 86% water and freezing it, the resulting material was no longer just ice. It was a super material. It had the structural strength of concrete. It melted incredibly slowly due to the insulating wood fibers, and most shockingly, it was virtually indestructible. The true potential of pykrete was proven in one of the most comical yet significant meetings of the war. Lord Mountbatten, a champion of the project, burst into a strategy meeting in Quebec to demonstrate the material to the combined chiefs of staff. He brought 2 blocks, one of pure ice and one of pykrete. He drew his service pistol and fired into the ordinary ice, which shattered instantly. Then, he turned his gun on the pykrete block. The bullet ricocheted off the frozen block with a sharp asterisk zing asterisk, buzzing around the room and reportedly grazing the leg of an American admiral. The demonstration was chaotic, but the point was made. This wasn't just ice. It was bulletproof armor that could be manufactured from water and sawdust. The project, codenamed Habakkuk, was given the green light. The specifications for the asterisk HMS Habakkuk asterisk were terrifying in scale. This was not going to be a ship. It was to be a floating continent. The design called for a vessel 2,000 feet long and 300 feet wide, dwarfing the asterisk RMS. Titanic asterisk and nearly twice the size of modern nuclear supercarriers. It would displace over 2 million tons. The hull would be 40 feet thick, effectively immune to torpedoes. A German torpedo might blow a crater in the side. But the ship wouldn't sink, and repairs would simply involve pouring a bucket of water and sawdust into the hole and letting it freeze. To keep the ship from melting in the Atlantic summer, a massive system of refrigeration pipes would run through the hull, circulating cold air like a giant floating freezer. It was designed to carry 150 planes, including heavy bombers that could never launch from a standard steel deck. A prototype was actually built in total secrecy on Patricia Lake in Alberta, Canada. Weighing 1,000 tons, it was kept frozen through the summer of 1943, proving that the science worked. The British were ready to reshape naval warfare. But just as the blueprints were being finalized, the reality of war shifted. The range of Allied aircraft improved with the introduction of long-range fuel tanks, closing the mid-Atlantic gap. Portugal allowed the Allies to use airfields in the Azores, further shrinking the U-boats' hunting grounds. And critically, the immense cost of the refrigeration steel needed for Habakkuk asterisk began to approach the cost of simply building a conventional carrier. The project was quietly shelved, and the prototype in Canada was left to melt, taking 3 hot summers to finally disappear. Project Habakkuk remains the most audacious what-if of World War II, a testament to a time when the British were desperate enough to try and conquer the ocean by turning it into a weapon. 2. In the annals of military history, there are weapons born of genius, and there are weapons born of madness. But in 1942, the line between the two vanished completely. Following the shock of Pearl Harbor, the United States was desperate for a way to strike back at the Japanese mainland. In this climate of anger and urgency, a Pennsylvania dentist named Lytle S. Adams wrote a letter to the White House with an idea that sounded like a hallucination. He proposed that the U.S. military shouldn't send bombers or Marines to destroy Japanese cities. They should send bats. Specifically, millions of bats, each strapped with a tiny napalm bomb, released from airplanes in the dead of night. It was an idea that should have been laughed out of the room. Instead, because Adams happened to be a friend of Eleanor Roosevelt, the letter reached the president, and the U.S. military launched one of the most bizarre top-secret operations of the war, Project X-ray. The logic behind the madness was surprisingly sound, rooted in the specific architecture of the enemy. Japanese cities at the time were largely constructed of wood, bamboo, and paper. Adams reasoned that while conventional explosives did damage, fire was the true enemy of Tokyo. He identified the Mexican free-tailed bat as the perfect delivery system. These bats were plentiful, could carry payloads nearly equal to their own body weight. And crucially, they had a biological instinct to hide in dark, secluded places during the day. The plan was terrifyingly simple. Load thousands of hibernating bats into bomb casings, drop them over a city at dawn, and let them wake up. Instinct would drive them to roost in the eaves and attics of thousands of homes. At a designated time, a chemical timer would ignite the napalm, simultaneously starting thousands of fires across the city, overwhelming the fire department and burning the infrastructure to the ground. The Marines took the project seriously enough to begin testing in the deserts of the American Southwest. They designed a miniature incendiary device, weighing less than an ounce, which could burn for 8 minutes with a flame intense enough to melt steel. The bats were chilled to force them into hibernation, strapped with the dummy explosives and loaded onto planes. But biology is difficult to command. During a live demonstration at the Carlsbad Army Airfield Auxiliary Base in New Mexico, things went spectacularly wrong. A group of armed bats woke up earlier than expected and escaped their handlers. True to their nature, they sought out the darkest, safest places they could find: the eaves of the barracks, the control tower, and even a general's car. What followed was a perfect, accidental demonstration of the weapon's effectiveness. The timers ticked down, and suddenly, the U.S. Air Force Base was on fire. The bats burned the testing facility to the ground. The facility's destruction was a disaster for the base commander, but for the scientists, it was a perverse success. The data showed that the bats were incredibly effective pound for pound. They caused more destruction than a standard firebomb. The National Defense Research Committee concluded that a single bomber load of bats could start nearly 5,000 fires at once, creating a firestorm that no city could survive. Despite its terrifying potential and the millions of dollars spent, Project X-ray was ultimately doomed by the clock. The project moved slowly, plagued by the complexity of handling live animals and reliable timers. By 1944, the military needed a weapon that was ready immediately. Another top-secret project, the Manhattan Project, was nearing completion of the atomic bomb. The bat bomb was deemed too slow and too unpredictable compared to the splitting of the atom. The project was cancelled, leaving the bat bomb as a strange footnote in history, a moment when the U.S. military was ready to turn nature itself into a weapon of mass destruction, stopped only by the invention of something even deadlier. 3. In the era before microchips, GPS, or digital processors, the United States military faced a frustrating paradox. They could build powerful missiles, but they couldn't guarantee they would hit anything smaller than a city block. As World War II raged, the guidance systems of the day were primitive. often relying on simple clockwork or radio signals that were easily jammed. The military needed a computer fast enough to process visual data and adjust a missile's flight path in real time, but such technology was decades away. Into this void stepped B.F. Skinner, a Harvard psychologist who proposed that the most sophisticated guidance system on Earth wasn't a machine, but a bird. He believed that where electronics failed, biology would succeed. His solution was Project Pigeon. Skinner's design was technically brilliant and bizarrely simple. He took the nose cone of a Pelican glide bomb and modified it to hold 3 separate lenses, which projected an image of the ground onto a small screen inside. Behind this screen sat 3 trained pigeons. Using the principles of operant conditioning, Skinner had taught these birds to recognize the shape of enemy ships. When a bird saw a ship on the screen, it would furiously peck at it. These pecks were not just frantic movements, they were data. The screen was wired to the missile's steering fins. If the target moved to the left, the pigeon pecked to the left, and the fins adjusted the course to center the target. To ensure reliability, Skinner used a democracy of 3 birds. The missile would only turn if the majority of the pigeons agreed on the direction. The results were shockingly effective. In simulation tests, the pigeons were relentless. They could track a target through heavy cloud cover, ignore countermeasures, and remain focused despite the noise and vibration of a rocket launch. They were unjammable, disposable, and mass-producible. Skinner had essentially created an organic computer that ran on grain. However, the project was ultimately killed not by failure, but by laughter. When Skinner presented his findings to top military officials in Washington, the idea of handing the outcome of the war over to a trio of farm birds was simply too absurd for the generals to accept. One official reportedly said there was no way they could trust a weapon that might get distracted by a piece of birdseed. Although the project was canceled in 1944 in favor of emerging radar technology, the pigeon-guided missile remains a testament to the strange ingenuity of the war, a moment when the U.S. government seriously considered that the future of high-tech warfare might have feathers. 4. As the Allies looked toward the fortified coast of France in 1943, they faced a singular, terrifying obstacle. The Atlantic Wall. Hitler had encased the beaches in reinforced concrete 10 feet thick, designed to stop any tank or infantryman dead in their tracks. To breach this fortress, the British Admiralty turned to the Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development, a secretive group of eccentrics better known as the Weezers and Dodgers. Their solution was not a bigger bomb or a heavier tank, but something that looked like it had rolled out of a Victorian nightmare. They called it the Great Panjandrum. The device was essentially two massive steel wheels, each 10 feet in diameter, connected by a central drum packed with a ton of high explosives. The concept was terrifyingly simple. Dozens of cordite rockets were strapped to the rim of the wheels. When ignited, these rockets would spin the wheels up to speeds of 60 miles per hour, turning the device into a supersonic rolling bomb that would scream across the beach, smash into the concrete fortifications, and detonate, blowing a hole for the tanks to drive through. It was a weapon designed to rely on brute momentum and pure chaos. However, the laws of physics are rarely cooperative with such unguided fury. The testing took place on the beaches of Westward Ho, in Devon, where the Panjandrum quickly proved that it had a mind of its own. In the final, now infamous test, a crowd of VIPs, including admirals and generals, gathered on the sand dunes to watch the weapon in action. When the rockets were ignited, the Panjandrum roared to life with a deafening screech, throwing up clouds of smoke and sand. But as it gathered speed, one of the rockets failed, and the machine lost its balance. It didn't just roll forward. It began to veer wildly, violently wobbling as rockets tore loose and flew into the sky like erratic fireworks. What happened next turned a military experiment into a scene of slapstick terror. The massive, burning wheel turned sharply and headed straight for the assembled VIPs. The documentary footage captured the chaos as dignified generals, admirals, and the official cinematographer were forced to flee for their lives, diving behind sand dunes as the flaming wheel chased them down the beach. The Panjandrum eventually crashed into the sea and disintegrated in a hiss of steam, sparing the officers but killing the project instantly. It was never used in combat, but the Great Panjandrum remains the ultimate symbol of British wartime ingenuity, a weapon that was equal parts brilliance, madness, and total uncontrollability. 5. As the Allied armies swept across Germany in the spring of 1945, intelligence officers weren't just hunting for war criminals. They were hunting for the future. They knew the Nazis had developed jet fighters and ballistic missiles. But in a research facility near Hillersleben, they uncovered plans for a weapon that made the V-2 rocket look like a firecracker. Buried in the technical files of the German Artillery Division was a project that read like the script of a science fiction nightmare. The Sonnengewehr*, or sun gun. The concept was terrifyingly simple and ambitious. The Nazis had seriously investigated the feasibility of placing a massive, concave mirror into geostationary orbit, 5,100 miles above the Earth, to focus the power of the sun into a concentrated beam of destruction. The scale of the engineering was baffling. The design called for a reflector surface stretching over 3 square miles, constructed from metallic sodium. This wasn't just a satellite. It was a manned space station. The plans included details for a crew to live inside the structure, breathing oxygen produced by vast onboard pumpkin gardens and wearing magnetic shoes to walk in zero gravity. The scientists had calculated that by tilting the mirror, they could direct a beam of intensified sunlight onto any point on the globe. This beam would be hot enough to boil reservoirs, wither crops, or burn entire cities to ash in seconds. It was the ultimate high ground, a weapon that could strike New York or Moscow without a single soldier leaving orbit. When American experts analyzed the data, they didn't dismiss the physics. The science was theoretically sound, rooted in the principles of Archimedes. However, the timeline was the delusion. The German scientists estimated it would take 50 to 100 years to build. It was a project for a 1,000-year Reich that would never exist. The sun gun plans were eventually published in Life magazine in 1957. Shocking the American public. While it never left the drawing board, the sun gun remains the most chilling example of Nazi ambition, a regime so obsessed with domination that they tried to weaponize the sun itself. 6. Amidst the thunder of heavy armor and the scream of artillery, Allied soldiers invading Europe encountered a weapon that looked suspiciously like a child's toy. It was barely 4 feet long, knee-high, and chugged along on tiny tracks, seemingly dwarfed by the massive Tiger tanks and Panthers around it. But this was no toy. It was the Leichter Leidjungistar Goliath *, the world's first mass-produced remote-controlled combat vehicle. The Germans named it Goliath in a fit of irony, while Allied troops, amused and terrified in equal measure, called them beetles or doodlebugs. The concept was simple but deadly. Instead of risking a squad of combat engineers to destroy a bunker or disable a tank, the Germans would send this mechanical suicide bomber, packed with up to 100 kilograms of high explosives. The Goliath was designed to drive directly under an enemy tank or into a fortification and detonate, vaporizing everything in the immediate vicinity. The technology behind the Goliath was a strange mix of innovation and limitation. It wasn't radio-controlled. Instead, it trailed a massive spool of 3-strand telephone wire behind it, sometimes stretching for nearly half a mile. The operator would sit safely in a trench or a bunker, steering the miniature tank using a joystick box connected to the wire. In the chaos of the Warsaw Uprising and the beaches of Normandy, these machines were initially terrifying. Seeing a robotic bomb relentlessly crawling toward your position was a psychological horror that modern soldiers facing drones would recognize. However, the Goliath had a fatal, low-tech flaw. It was agonizingly slow, moving at a pace of just 6 miles per hour, barely a jogging speed. Combat experience quickly stripped away the Goliath's fear factor. Allied infantry soon realized that you didn't need a bazooka to stop one. You just needed a pair of wire cutters or a well-aimed bullet. Smart soldiers would simply wait for the machine to trundle into the open and shoot the trailing control wire, instantly turning the deadly robot into a harmless, stranded paperweight. Many were captured intact and driven around by laughing American G's as prank vehicles, while the Goliath failed to change the tide of the war due to its fragility and cost. It remains a fascinating ancestor to modern warfare, the clumsy, wire-tethered grandfather of the bomb disposal robots and unmanned ground vehicles used by armies today. In 1941, as the clouds of war darkened over Europe, one of the most distinctly American symbols in the world faced an existential crisis inside the Third Reich. Coca-Cola had been a massive success in pre-war Germany, with sales exploding at the 1936 Berlin Olympics. But as the Allies tightened their naval blockade, the supply of the secret 7X flavoring syrup, the magic ingredient that made Coke was completely cut off. Max Kies, the head of Coca-Cola Deutschland, stared at a nightmare scenario. His factories were operational, his trucks were ready, but he had nothing to bottle. To save the company from bankruptcy and seizure by the Nazi state, Keith decided to brew a new beverage from the only thing he had in abundance: industrial garbage. The recipe was a concoction born of pure desperation, utilizing the leftovers of the leftovers from other food industries. Keith's chemists scavenged apple fiber mash left over from cider presses and whey, the watery byproduct of cheese curdling. It was a murky, beige liquid that smelled slightly of cheese and tasted vastly different from the sugary cola the public loved. To sweeten it, they used whatever was available, from beet sugar to saccharin. When it came time to name this Frankenstein creation, Keith told his team to use their imagination in German, *fantasy*. A salesman named Joe Nip immediately shouted out, "Fanta." The name stuck, and a wartime legend was born. Fanta became the beverage of the German home front, but not entirely for the reasons one might think. While it was a popular drink, it was also a lifeline for housewives struggling with severe sugar rationing. The soda was so sweet that many German families used it as a cooking ingredient, pouring it into soups and stews to add calories and flavor to their meager war diets. By 1943, sales had soared to 3 million cases a year, keeping the Coca-Cola machinery running throughout the devastation of the war. When the dust settled and American troops entered the ruined German factories in 1945, they found the bottling plants still standing and the books balanced. The Coca-Cola Company in Atlanta reclaimed their subsidiary and the profits, eventually reformulating the desperate wartime brew into the bright orange soda the world knows today. It is a strange twist of history that the colorful, fun drink found in every vending machine began its life as a cheese byproduct survival ration in the heart of Nazi Germany. 8. While the world looked up in terror at the V-1 Buzz bombs and the supersonic V-2 rockets, Adolf Hitler was secretly constructing a third weapon of vengeance deep in the limestone hills of Pas-de-Calais. France, a weapon so massive it was effectively a geographical feature. This was the V3, codenamed the hot truck pump or high-pressure pump, but the engineers who built it simply called it the Centipede. It was a supergun of apocalyptic proportions, designed not just to damage London, but to erase it from the map through a continuous, unceasing rain of explosives. The engineering behind the V3 was a radical departure from traditional artillery. A standard cannon hits the shell once with a single explosion. The V3, however, featured a barrel over 400 feet long, lined with dozens of side chambers branching off like the legs of a centipede. As the shell traveled up the barrel, these side charges would detonate in a precise, timed sequence, adding more and more velocity to the projectile until it exited the muzzle at 3,350 miles per hour. The Nazi plan called for a battery of 25 of these guns to be buried inside the fortress of Memoix, angled permanently toward London. Once operational, they were calculated to fire 600 shells an hour, 24 hours a day, turning the British capital into a pile of rubble within weeks. Fortunately for the citizens of London, the sheer scale of the construction made it impossible to hide. Allied reconnaissance planes spotted the suspicious anthill activity of rail lines and tunnel entrances disappearing into the French hillside. Realizing that standard bombs would just scratch the surface of the bunkers, the Royal Air Force deployed their own superweapon, the Tallboy earthquake bomb, designed by the legendary Barnes-Wallis. In July 1944, the precipice of the war shifted when the elite 617 Squadron the Dambusters dropped these 12,000-pound monsters directly onto the hill. The shockwaves collapsed the chalk tunnels, burying the V-3 guns and the workforce inside them. The weapon that was designed to end the war with a roar was silenced before it could fire a single shot at London, leaving behind only twisted metal tubes in the dark French earth. In 1941, Hedy Lamarr was worshipped as the most beautiful woman in the world, a Hollywood goddess who graced the silver screen in films like Ziegfeld Girl. But while the world saw a glamour icon, they missed the brilliant engineering mind hiding behind the makeup. Lamarr was bored by the shallow conversations of Hollywood parties and terrified by the news coming from the Atlantic, where German U-boats were decimating Allied shipping. She understood that radio-controlled torpedoes were the solution, but they had a fatal flaw. The guidance signal was static. If the Germans found the frequency, they could simply jam it, sending the torpedo off course. Lamarr realized she needed a signal that couldn't be caught away to make the radio waves dance. Teaming up with an garde composé nommé Georgenté, Lamarr developed a concept that was as artistic as it was technical. They drew inspiration from the synchronized player piano's antile used in his concerts. They reasoned that if a piano roll could trigger different notes in a rapid, preset sequence, a radio transmitter could do the same with frequencies. They designed a system where both the torpedo and the guiding ship would switch frequencies simultaneously, hopping from one channel to another in a random pattern known only to them. To a German jammer, the signal would sound like mere static, impossible to lock onto. They called it frequency hopping, and it was a stroke of genius decades ahead of its time. However, the U.S. Navy was not ready to take tactical advice from a movie star. When Lamarr presented her patent for a secret communication system, the brass dismissed it, patronizingly suggesting she could better serve the war effort by using her beauty to sell war bonds rather than designing weapons. The patent was classified and shoved into a filing cabinet, gathering dust for decades. It wasn't until the Cuban Missile Crisis that the military finally implemented the technology on naval ships. Today, Lamarr's invention has escaped the ocean and conquered the air. The principle of spread-spectrum technology she pioneered is the backbone of the modern digital world. Every time you connect to Wi-Fi, pair a Bluetooth speaker, or use GPS, your device is performing the same electronic dance Hedy Lamarr choreographed in her living room in 1941. The woman once famous for her face is now the silent architect of the wireless age. 10. In the shadowy corridors of British biological warfare research, desperation led to the creation of a plan so dark it makes conventional bombing look almost merciful. By 1942, the British government feared that the Nazis were preparing to unleash biological weapons on the UK in a preemptive move to secure a retaliatory option. Scientists at the secret facility of Porton Down conceived Operation Vegetarian. The objective was not to target soldiers on the front lines, but to strike at the very stomach of the Third Reich. The weapon was a small, innocent-looking linseed cattle cake, roughly the size of a bar of soap. But inside each cake was a glass ampule containing billions of spores of *Bacillus anthracis *anthrax. The logic of the operation was terrifyingly efficient. The plan called for the Royal Air Force to drop 5 million of these cakes over the grazing pastures of northern Germany. The cattle, attracted to the linseed, would eat them, shattering the glass ampules. Within days, the cows would sicken and die, wiping out Germany's beef and dairy supply in a single stroke. But the horror didn't stop at the animals. The anthrax spores would contaminate the meat, and anyone who consumed it would contract intestinal anthrax, a disease with a near 100% fatality rate. Furthermore, the bacteria would leach into the soil, rendering the German countryside uninhabitable and poisonous for decades. It was a strategy of total ecological warfare, designed to starve a nation into submission. To test the viability of this apocalypse, the British government purchased the remote, uninhabited island of Gruinard off the coast of Scotland. They took a flock of sheep to the island and detonated an anthrax bomb. The results were immediate and chilling. The sheep began dying within days, and the island became so contaminated that it was declared a forbidden zone. The soil remained lethal for nearly 50 years. 5 million of the cakes were manufactured and stored, ready for deployment. The only thing that stopped Operation Vegetarian was the success of the Normandy invasion. As Allied troops pushed into Europe, the strategic need for such a weapon vanished, and the cakes were incinerated in massive furnaces. Gruinard Island, however, stood as a toxic monument to the plan until 1986, when a massive decontamination effort finally allowed the warning signs to be taken down. A stark reminder of how close the world came to a biological nightmare.